This week on Engage the Sage.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Engage the Sage. Things have been a little bit different. We haven't had videos come up quite as much. We don't have my normal background, but we thought it was still important to have some conversations about teaching, teaching philosophies, and teaching practices. So today we're going to talk about how to engage the sage when the sage is teaching at home. One of the things that I found is there's a lot of challenge to teaching remotely. There's a lot of challenges that I'm facing about putting my content out there for my students to do asynchronously, right? Asynchronous learning is where you put the information out there and then your students do it at their own pace. They access the information at their own pace. They do the assignments at their own pace. They get them back to you. And that's different. I'm used to the face-to-face classroom. I'm used to the exchange back and forth. I'm used to being there with my students. So I'm facing some challenges. And as many of you know, the foundation of my teaching philosophy of Engage the Sage is that the engagement of the instructor trickles down to the engagement of the students, and they learn better as a result. So what I'm struggling to do, and I think I have some recommendations for how to do this, is to engage the sage, to engage the person teaching remotely so that their students will be more engaged in the learning that still needs to be done and will do so more effectively and they'll demonstrate better learning. So we have 5 recommendations for you about how you can engage the sage when the sage is teaching at home. The first recommendation, and if you've seen our teaching during a crisis video, and you should, if you've seen that video, we talked about streamlining and prioritizing your content. And I'm going to double down on that recommendation. I think right now, one of the best ways to stay engaged as a teacher is to make sure that everything you're teaching is important, that everything you're teaching is interesting. If you're like me, when our campus went remote, we actually lost a week of instruction. The week after spring break became a prep week for us to get ready for remote teaching, so we lost a week. So right there by definition, we are probably going to have less contact time to teach our students. So right now, more than ever, teach what you find interesting and model your engagement in that information. Let your students know why you've made the decision to teach that information. Model that engagement, they'll be more engaged and they will learn better. The second recommendation that I'm going to make for how you can engage the sage when the sage is teaching at home is to find ways to innovate. Find interesting ways to be creative and to do new things in your classes. Now, I'm not saying restructure the entire thing. I'm not saying put a lot of work on yourself, because something you've probably heard me say before, and my students out there, you definitely heard me say this when I'm teaching you to teach, is every assignment that you give is going to come back. So what I'm recommending is find little ways to try new things. For a lot of us, myself included, this move to remote teaching has exposed me to technology that I previously had no idea about. I definitely wasn't fluent in. So I'm thinking about ways, even when I go back to face-to-face classrooms, about ways that I can use asynchronous features and video and things like Zoom, a lot of the tools in Canvas, the course management system that my campus uses, to get information to my students so they can learn more. So what I'm doing now is I'm using this kind of as a lab, as a research experience, as an experimentation opportunity to try little things, not big things that create a lot of work for me, but little things right now. And it's that experimentation that is keeping me excited and engaged in my teaching right now. The third recommendation for engaging the sage when the sage is teaching at home is to only give assignments that are interesting to you. I just mentioned those assignments you give are going to come back. Give assignments that you want to come back, that you're looking forward to have come back. One of the things that I'm doing in my classes, I have mission assignments. I have them go out into their world and to apply social psychological theory of helping, of antisocial behavior, of prejudice and discrimination, to see the world around them and to try to change the world around them. Well, what I'm doing now is I'm modifying those missions for the circumstances that we have. So maybe now they're going to happen in more online interactions than in-person interactions. Maybe they're going to be directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic. What I'm doing is I'm giving assignments to my students that I want to see. One of the assignments that I'm most excited about is I'm having my students not take my exams, but create their own exams and then take the exams that they've created. And we're going to talk about this more in a future video. But I'm so excited when that due date is getting closer, when that time gets closer, that I can peek at what they've done. One of the things that I'm doing to keep myself engaged in my teaching right now is to make sure that the things that I'm teaching are producing assignments that I want to read. The fourth thing that I'm going to recommend to engage the sage when the sage is teaching at home is to put things out there for your students that require responses. And you've heard me say before, there are no requirements, right? But give your students the opportunity to respond to you. One of the biggest things that I'm having trouble with is that when I'm teaching now asynchronously, I don't get to see my students provide me with nonverbal feedback while they're learning. I don't get to see them engage. I don't get to see them being confused. And as a result, I don't know if that information is being learned as well as it could be. So one of the things that I'm doing now is I'm having weekly assignments in all of my classes. And typically I'm having them do things like tell me what's the most surprising thing that you learned, what are the three most important takeaways this week, and then what's a question or a concern that you have. So what happens is all of my students in all of my classes are having weekly brief contact with me about the information that I've put there out there into the abyss. And what I can see now is that that information was accessed, and I can see where that confusion is. What I'm doing is I'm answering all of their questions in a video response that they can then watch again. And this provides me with opportunities to have that contact, that connection that I really thrive off of as a teacher, and what I really miss about my face-to-face classes. Something else that I'm doing is I'm having Zoom office hours. And we'll talk a little bit more how to maintain these connections. But I have these times synchronously, right, at the same time where students can come in, where we can talk about the content, we can chat about life, and we can have some of that connection. These are things that help me be engaged. The fifth and final recommendation that I'm going to make today about how to engage the sage when the sage is teaching at home is to set goals for yourself every day. One of the things that I know about myself, I love to-do lists, and I love crossing things off to-do lists. So each day I write my to-do list, and I start the things that are the most important, the highest priority things that I need to get done that day. And when I get those done, I feel better, I feel more engaged. But what's most important is that at least one of my goals each day is to do something that I find fulfilling and purposeful. Right now, I'm teaching at home. I have a spouse who's also teaching at home. We're both professors. I have two kids that are running around and interrupting us all the time. That we're also trying to kind of homeschool because their schools are closed right now. Right? We're splitting up the childcare, we're splitting up the homeschooling, we're splitting up the time on Zoom, all of those kinds of things. When I have my time, I make sure that some of my time is spent doing things that make me feel like I'm being valuable as a professional. So maybe it's designing a new research project. Maybe it's answering a new question. Maybe it's reading an article. Maybe it's doing an Engage the Sage video. But I try to find a way, this is my goal that keeps myself engaged, to do something fulfilling for me professionally every day. So what we've given you are 5 recommendations that I think will help you engage the sage when the sage is teaching at home. And when you're more engaged, your students will be more engaged, and they will learn more, right? That whole premise of our trickle-down engagement teaching philosophy. And as you do this, you're going to feel more connected, you're going to feel more vibrant, and it's going to be a better way to keep your students learning while you're staying engaged in your teaching. Now, one of the things I mentioned today is that it's important to have responses to the stuff you put out there into the abyss. So I want you in the comments to tell us how you are engaging yourself in your teaching now while you're teaching remotely. Please like, subscribe, sign up for notifications, and share us on social media because those connections are even more important now than they ever were. And we'll see you next time on Engage the Sage.